I now turn to Alexandra Runswick to continue the case for the proposition.
It's a great honour to speak here tonight, and thank you very much for the invitation. If I were to ask any one of you if you felt that we lived in a democratic society, I'm sure that for the majority of you, the answer would be a resounding yes. We have a parliament governed by age-old, well-tested rules. We have a franchise that gives each adult a vote. We have regular elections, some may say too regular at the moment, and now increasingly frequent referendums where voters can have their say. On the surface, at least, we have a fair and flourishing democracy. The UK is by no measure a failed state. Democracy, however, is a process and not an event. And if we look more closely at the process, it is certainly clear to me, and I hope it will also be clear to you, that our democracy is for sale. If we look closely, we see that it is not the will of the people that shapes our political agenda. It is the money pulled from the deep pockets of wealthy individuals and corporations that on the whole funds our elections, secures unparalleled levels of access and influence to policymakers, and that ultimately shapes what politicians prioritise. It could be argued that because we don't have a culture of endemic bribery, that we don't have corruption. That because our institutions are old and established, and we have abolished rotten boroughs, that our democracy is free and fair. The fact is, when it comes to access and influence and power, it is those with money whose voices are deemed more important than any other. Private donors, companies and lobbyists are given exclusive policy access that is simply not affordable for the average member of the public. Whether this takes the form of sweetheart deals and manifestos or budgets, a seat in the House of Lords, or a private dinner with the Prime Minister, big money grants those who have it significant influence over elections, politicians and even public discourse. So when I took to task the question of whether our democracy is for sale in preparation for this debate, and reflected on the work I've done over the past decade in this area, 3 key points really crystallised the issue for me. Firstly, the exploitation of UK electoral law, specifically around expenses, through which political parties secure undue influence over election outcomes. Secondly, the influence of private and corporate donors over political parties and their respective agendas. And thirdly, and more broadly, the pervasiveness of the lobbying industry and the hijacking of policymaking by corporate power. I'd firstly like to turn to looking at electoral law, and Paul has already touched on this briefly. Michael Crick has quoted one MP as saying that it was well known that electoral law had loopholes and that you could drive a coach and horses through them. I think it's safe to say, after the recent scandals, that the Conservative Party have proved you can drive a battle bus through them. In the UK, we have spending limits in place to prevent one candidate from being unfairly advantaged over others simply due to their ability to out-fundraise and outspend. This also has the effect of mitigating the extent to which individual candidates can become beholden to the private agenda of a single donor. Or at least that's the theory. In practice, what happens is political parties with large war chests can flagrantly flout electoral law with little fear of repercussion. Paul mentioned in his speech the fact that the Electoral Commission recently fined the Conservative Party a record amount of £70,000 for inaccurate and incomplete spending returns. The Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party were also fined £20,000 for errors in their spending returns in the 2015 general election. When you bear in mind that over £39 million was spent in the 2015 general election, a fine of £70,000 could be considered money well spent, and that for some parties, flouting electoral law could be considered a strategic advantage. Parties are able to splash their cash come election time not only by the help of our broken electoral law, but because donors with deep pockets help parties to operate at a price. And the second point I will address today will be the role of party donors, both corporate and individual, in distorting democratic processes. In the UK, we do not have a cap on donations that can be made to political parties. As long as you are on the UK electoral register or a company trading in the United Kingdom, you're entitled to donate any amount of money that you wish to a political party. While parties are membership organisations and do obtain fees from members, the main political parties are largely reliant on a small number of high-value donors to fill their election war chests. In the 2015 general election, as I said, £39 million was spent on the campaign, and in the preceding year, the Conservatives received more money from one multimillionaire than all their members put together. And although I'm highlighting the Conservative Party here, this is mainly because they are in power at the moment, and so they are the best example of where the money is in UK politics at the moment, rather than suggesting that they are the only party that this applies to. These individuals and companies are afforded significant influence over their respective parties and their policy agendas. This creates an imbalance in the representation of issues that matter to the majority of people versus those issues that matter to a small number of elite individuals and private companies. I've certainly questioned how coincidental it is that the Conservatives' manifesto has essentially promised to abolish the Serious Fraud Office, which investigates white-collar crime, when the body is investigating a key donor, Ayman Asfari. Asfari happens to be the Prime Minister's business ambassador, and together with his wife has given over £800,000 to the Conservatives since 2009. Equally, I can only assume that the 3 oil executives who have given Theresa May £390,000 since she became Prime Minister were also pleased about the unprecedented government support that was pledged in the recent manifesto. According to Stuart Wheeler, a man famous for making the largest single donation to a political party in the United Kingdom, £5 million in case you were wondering, a donor's ability to influence party policy is absolutely natural and unobjectionable. What you get is access and influence. For £5,000, you can join the Labour's 1,000 Club and get a chance to meet high-profile Labour politicians. The entry fee, perhaps unsurprisingly for the Conservative equivalent of the Leaders Club, is £50,000, but you'll be invited to a series of dinners, post-PMQs, lunches, drinks receptions, election results events, and important campaign launches, with attendees from last year's events including Boris Johnson, David Davis, Philip Hammond, and of course Theresa May. It's this simple. If you can pay the price, then you can purchase access to those in power and influence over our democratic processes. My third point is about lobbying, and the previous speaker did a valiant job of defending lobbying in a democracy. I don't believe anybody tonight is going to be calling for an outright ban on lobbying. Certainly, I would freely confess I am in fact a lobbyist. I don't work for a company, I work for a voluntary sector organisation, but I lobby on the issue of lobbying transparency. Lobbying is not in itself a problem. The issue is the secrecy, because as we know, lobbying works best when it's in the shadows. My argument is that for democracy to flourish, it's not that you should ban lobbying, but that you need to bring it out of the darkness. Because often when companies are lobbying, it's not clear that that's what they are in fact doing. It's not as simple as just, are they meeting government ministers? Lobbyist tactics have become highly sophisticated, so much that you may not even know that they are operating. They fake grassroots support, which is known as astroturfing, by flooding the internet with an army of social media bots that tweet, comment, and even blog favourably about the company's aims and counter-arguments put forward by oppositions. They also set up front groups to provide a seemingly more legitimate mouthpiece to espouse their lines. Smokers' rights group Forest, for example, is funded almost entirely by Big Tobacco. The anti-sugar tax campaign Can the Tax is run by lobbying firm Portland on behalf of the global softer drinks clients. And the supposedly independent pro-privatisation group Doctors for Reform was set up by lobbying firm Westbourne Communications, which refuses to reveal the campaign's funders. Companies also fund research from well-established think tanks to add a layer of intellectual validity to their perspective. Think tanks like the Adam Smith Institute, the Institute for Economic Affairs, and the Taxpayers Alliance don't publish their funders, so it's impossible to scrutinise whether or not their research has been commissioned by those with vested interests. Just last week, the Institute for Economic Affairs, which has received consistent funding from the British American Tobacco, published a report criticising the UK's tobacco laws. And drip by drip, the messages put forward by so-called independent consumer groups and the policy positions developed by so-called independent research makes its way into the national policy discourse and into the agenda of ministers, MPs, and alike. There is undeniably a level of dissatisfaction with the political status quo, which was borne out during the campaign leading up to and following the EU referendum last year. This is in part attributable to people feeling that they do not have control or influence over a distant Westminster. And I would argue that that feeling is well-founded. I urge you to support the motion.